Dr. Colin Ellard, welcome to the Neuroarchitect.
Thank you.
Please tell us more about your career path and the motivations behind your focus on examining the organization and appearance of natural and built spaces and its impact on movement, wayfinding, emotion, and physiology.
My goodness, I could tell you a very long story about this, but I'll try to keep it to a reasonable length. I began my scientific career as I always called myself a kind of hardcore wet lab neuroscientist, by which I mean that I studied animals, and I was interested in how animals solved problems of space and how their brains were designed to solve spatial problems. So I was kind of working in this is a little bit of a tangent already, but I was kind of working in a context where people designed different kinds of apparatus for measuring spatial behavior in animals, like, the classic rat maze that we see in New Yorker cartoons, for example. And I had this idea that it might make more sense to study how animals did space by looking at the kinds of spaces that animals built. And so when I had this idea originally, I was thinking of things like, there's some fantastic animal architecture, termite mounds, bird nests, even the animals that I studied, which were mostly rodents, they build these elaborate burrow systems sometimes. So I thought, let them show me how they're designing spaces, and that'll help me to understand how their brain's organized. And at that point, it had, astonishingly looking back, it had not occurred to me to think of the obvious candidate animal for that kind of approach. I never thought of looking at how human beings design spaces and what that told us about the design of their minds and their behavior. And so, that was sort of, I guess it was early to mid careerish. I had this kind of epiphany that that's what I wanted to do. And I was naive enough at the time to think that I was the first person who had ever had the idea of combining architecture with neuroscience. And that,
Which year was that?
oh, this was, it was around 2010. And so I was actually on a sabbatical at the time. I was living in a little village in the east coast of Canada, just to take a break from everything and, sort myself out. And I came back from that sabbatical and I just looked through the directory of, the architecture school here at the University of Waterloo to see if I could find somebody who might think that I had a good idea. And so I picked somebody, made an appointment, went to see him, and his response basically was that he had been waiting for 20 years for someone like me to walk through his door. So what ended up being a planned half an hour coffee meeting, ended up being the whole day for us. And then we went from there to building a lab, applying for grants, et cetera, et cetera. And off we went. So over the years, I discovered that, compared to now, where there really does seem to be some momentum in this convergence of different disciplines. Back then, even that short a time ago, that's only 15 years, there was much less going on. There were some really important people who had talked about and were thinking about the impact of psychology and neuroscience on architectural and urban design. But you really had to go looking for them. Whereas now, I think we're everywhere. So that was my initial motivation. I did this, I look back on it now and think that it was, for me, somewhat of a courageous act. I remember talking to colleagues that I had at the time about this idea that I had to basically make a radical switch in the kinds of things that I studied. And they said, well, that, you're known as the animal depth vision person. If you do this, you'll lose your funding. People won't know what to make of you. They'll think that you've gone a bit crazy. And all of those things were true. I did lose my funding for a while. Many people did think that I'd gone a bit crazy. Some of them probably still do, but, and maybe I did, but it worked out. I think that I, made a switch at exactly the right time for me and maybe for the world, because I think now there's vital interest in how to build a better world using the principles that come from psychology and neuroscience.
So yes, it takes courage, and I understand you because it aligns a little bit with what happened with me in 2011. So some people said, "What's this? It doesn't exist." And if you talk about this in front of people, they will make fun of you. So yeah, but we must insist and believe in what we see and in scientific findings also.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the way that I looked at it was that I was, for the work that I was doing, which I look back, I'm very proud of it. I still think it was interesting stuff. And I was getting a modest amount of funding. I mean, enough funding to keep a small lab going and to fund one or two graduate students. And I thought I could keep doing that forever and keep publishing papers that maybe a half a dozen people will read at best. I'll have my very small group of followers. And academia tolerates that to a great extent, I think, even still. And I thought, with that perspective, I thought, what if I really got to lose by doing something that I'm passionate, making that switch that I'm passionate about making? But yeah, I remember going for a beer with a colleague of mine, and I told him about this idea I had. And there was a long, thoughtful pause. And then he said, "Okay, but you wouldn't actually consider trying to write a grant application about this, would you?" As if, to encourage me to not even venture there. And I said, "Oh no, of course I wouldn't." And, at the time I was actually doing just that. And again, like it was greeted with, I'm not exactly sure what the right word to use would be, but it was accompanied by, for a while, a more or less complete loss of funding. And I was lucky enough, external funding, but I was lucky enough to be in a university and in a department that was very supportive of what I was trying to do. And I found ways on a shoestring to keep going. And, if you have a good idea, I think, the interest, the talented people, and eventually the funding comes back to you as it did. So things worked out. But yeah, it did feel a bit like jumping off of a cliff at the time. And I just, I was a lot younger than I guess, and I just thought, well, why not? What's the alternative?
It's very important to have a supportive academic frame and to have at least a small group, even if it's half a dozen. It's very important to start with the small group, small community, and it will grow. And it grew, actually.
Yeah.
And many people read your research.
Thank you. Yeah. The first of my books, which was about wayfinding, did reasonably well, but considering everything the second book, Places of the Heart, has had, I'm still sometimes bowled over by the impact that it seems to have when I meet strangers and they say, I've got your book on my desk. I think, wow, that book, I wrote it basically for myself as much as anything. And it really seems to have had some influence, and I know it has inspired people to enter this field, which, is just fantastic. It's the dream. And writing for a general audience has always been super important to me because, for lots of reasons, but one of the biggest ones being that I think that what will continue to motivate the successes of this field, neuroarchitecture, or whatever we eventually decide to call it, it'll be driven by public demand. And I think that demand comes from people understanding how profoundly important our surroundings are to everything, how we feel, our mental health, our cognitive state, the kinds of things that we decide to do. And so the biggest objective I had in writing that book was to convey that message, which now lots of other people are doing as well. There's some really, really great books written for general audiences that have the kinds of aims. And I think people, I mean, it's a work in progress, but I think people are beginning to get it. Yeah, I could go on and on about that. I mean, one of the other fun kind of repercussions of writing the book was that again, that kind of crisis time for me around 2010. I had our dean of arts at the University of Waterloo, was a fellow by the name of Kenneth Coates. And he was a historian, but he also wrote books for general audiences. My department chair at the time said, when Ken hears that you're writing a book for a general audience, he will open up the world to you. He'll do whatever. So I went to have a meeting with him about this, and he said, "What can I do for you? What can I do to help?" And I said, "Well, you could fund a virtual reality lab," and just sort of threw it out there at a time when VR labs were much more expensive than they are now. I mean, now you can get a kind of starter kit for not all that much money. But back then it was big numbers, six-figure numbers in Canadian dollars, US dollars as well, really. And he said, okay, he said, he had just taken the job, and he said, "I'm pretty new here." He said, "I don't know even how to get money, but I'll find out." And he called me. This was on a Friday afternoon. I thought, okay, that's the last I'll ever hear of this. On a Monday morning, he called me and he said, "I've got your money. Start spending it." And I was terrified, because now it was, now I had to follow through on these bold claims. But without that kind of assistance early on, I think it would have been very, very difficult for me to do even the small number of things that I've been able to do.
There are two challenges here. The first one is to, work on research and finding. That now that you have a grant and you have your lab, and at the same time, deliver this information for people in the academic field and for the public, like in simple words, to use the simple words also for people to catch the idea behind the work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important. I think, less so now than it used to be, but there was a time, when I was in the early part of my career, I'm thinking of, some of my mentors, and others who would say, that's, conveying ideas to a general audience, that's not your job. There are science writers, professional science writers, who have that expertise. Your job is to do the research, and that's it. And then the translation is left to others. And I think many, maybe most scientists don't really believe that anymore. And I think, I always took fairly seriously the obligation, to explain myself to ultimately, I mean, the people who were giving me the money. All of the research, not all of the research, but most of the research that I've done has been funded by taxpayers. It's been public programs. So I feel as though, I should be able to explain what I'm doing in a way that makes sense to people, why they would be interested in spending some of their hard-earned dollars to support my laboratory. But, even more than that, I just, thinking about, I think, we're all maybe a little tired of talking about the pandemic now, and it's until the next one, it's kind of fading into the past. But I think that was really telling, that when people were forced to stay in their own homes, they had to undergo this intensive examination of what that environment was like for them. And they also had to have the experience, for lots of people in the world, of that being their only environment. They were, we were for extensive periods of time locked in. Not that we couldn't leave our homes. Some parts of the world, people basically could not leave their homes. Here in Canada, people's movements were quite limited. And I feel as though having that firsthand experience of what it's like to live in environments that in most cases I think were impoverished during that time had an impact on people, and helped them to reflect on the importance of our settings, what they do for us, and how they can help us or harm us if they're if they're not built right.
So you're a neuroscientist and a psychologist. What research work and activities have you focused on, and what kind of, let's say, findings did you see that they are, particular or special or really helping people in their built environment?
I think, the first thing that comes to mind, and I guess that's because this is where we've been most active in recent years, is that I have what some people might call an obsession with the facades of buildings. So when we think about the impact of an architectural setting on psychology, brain state, what have you, a lot of the time we're thinking about the impact of the interiors of buildings, which is a legitimate concern because obviously we all, in modern human beings, for better or for worse, spend most of our time inside buildings. But I've always been interested in the impact of life on the street, streetscape design and appearance on psychological state. So, a very long time ago, and this dates to around the same time as when I began to shift my interests. I won't go through all of the autobiographical details of this. I'll just say that I became interested in questions about whether the way that the skin of a building, the facade of a building is designed, what kind of impact that has on mental state and even physiological state. So I did some early experiments with this, where I basically took people. I'm very fond of field approaches. They're very hard to do well, and we don't always do them well, but we do the best that we can, taking people to real places on the street and trying to measure real experience. And so one of the first ones of these kinds of studies that we did was, we did this in a number of different cities throughout the world, but we started in New York City for serendipitous reasons. And we found locations on the street that we thought, just by eyeballing, varied in what you could describe in different ways. These days, mostly we talk about complexity. Some people use the word entropy. Some people use the word permeability, just, simply put, the affordances, the opportunities that a streetscape might have for going into, it and leaving it, looking at things, interesting features. So we found a site that, was very low in those kinds of features, and another one that we thought was quite high. And again, at this stage, no careful measurement, just by eyeball and intuition. And then we took people to those two locations, among others, and we measured. We asked people how they felt. We measured their bodies, their states of physiological arousal, and we found that there were differences between the two sites. That when people were in the low complexity sites, we measured their bodies and showed that they had low levels of physiological arousal. But we also, when we asked them questions about how their emotional state was, we also lit up that they were not feeling very good. We talk about affect as that feeling in the moment, and the feeling in the moment when standing in this place was not good. So what sort of piqued my interest about that was that I have a colleague at the University of Waterloo. His name is James Dankert, who has literally written the book on boredom. And he did some studies, some laboratory studies with a graduate student of his at the time named Colin Merrifield. And they subjected participants. This was nothing to do with setting, really, but they showed participants videos that were really boring. Their boring video was, I think, a 20-minute video of men hanging laundry on a clothesline. And then they measured their physiological state, their emotional state, and they also measured salivary cortisol, so the stress hormone cortisol. And what they discovered was that when your arousal state is low and your emotional state is low, you actually increase production of cortisol. It's a stressful, negative experience. And
So boredom mean high levels of cortisol?
Yeah. In their experiments, subjecting people to 20 minutes of a boring experience increased cortisol levels. And so I basically made the leap from that to saying, look, if we are building facades that people are exposed to, even if it's not for a very long time, this was only 20 minutes in James's work, then it doesn't seem unreasonable to suppose that there is an impact of facade design on essentially public health. That you're changing people's levels of arousal, you're changing their emotional state, you're even changing their levels of cortisol. So all of that was kind of, that first experiment that we did was, I have to say, by the standards of the day, it's what we did, but by today's standards, it was pretty crude. Now, more recently, we've had a chance. I've begun a nice relationship with the Heatherwick studio in London. Thomas Heatherwick is an architect of some renown who has embarked on a planned 10-year campaign to raise awareness of the impact of boredom in architecture and in cities. And so he and I and his studio put together a project where we basically did what I had done a couple of decades ago, but using today's standards. So using better equipment, using finer measures, you're using more refined procedures. And I waited with bated breath. When you do this kind of thing, you think, oh, what if that early stuff that was not, very well executed was all wrong? And I've been spouting BS for, 15 years. As it turns out, the evidence that we collected in the more recent study, which was conducted in both Toronto and in London, England, was, if anything, more convincing than the early stuff, that there really is a psychological and physiological signature that is triggered by exposure to low complexity facades.
So it's as if there is some similarity between the two populations.
Yeah, I don't think that there was really any notable difference between the London sample and the Toronto sample, and that was a question that we thought was valid to ask, because the two cities are so different. I mean, by architectural standards, Toronto is all pretty young. I mean, Canada's still the Canada we know now is still a pretty young, the westernized Canada, let me put it that way, is still a pretty young country compared to United Kingdom. And people are on a daily basis exposed to a lot more different kinds of architecture there than there in Toronto. But the results were really uniform. So I think one of the ambitions for the Heatherwick studio going forward is to continue to advance this idea by maybe looking at other cultures. I know that there's a plan to do some work in Seoul, Korea in the coming over 2025. And I suspect that the whatever happens there, the findings will be not markedly different to what we've already shown. That low complexity facades are not very good for us.
So even also there are differences in the cultural identity and the social identity. So at a conscious level, they might choose maybe other words to describe what they're feeling, but when you measure it, the findings will be almost similar, right? At an bodily level, let's say anatomic level.
You're right. I mean, you've pinpointed something really interesting there. I think that you do when you enter into work in other cultures, you have to be very careful about the language that you use. I think my first experience of this was when we did some work in Berlin, and I don't speak fluent German by any means. And so I did some rough and ready translation of the questions we were asking. And then somebody who was helping to facilitate the experiment looked at the translation, he said, in German, there are several different meanings of the word arousal. And he said, you are definitely using the wrong kind of arousal in your study. You can't ask people about this. So we had to change everything. One of the things that we do, and this is not really a complete fix, I don't think, but we use these tools called self-assessment mannequins, which are basically just cartoons that, for affect might show a smiling face as opposed to a frowning face. And there's some symbolism that's meant to reflect differences in degrees of arousal, physiological arousal or excitement, I guess. So as much as possible, we try to avoid forcing people to use our language when we do these studies. But I'm sure that's, that you're right, that there's some thorny issues in asking people questions. But you have to do that. We talk about this a lot, that, sometimes people say if you've got these sophisticated measures of people's level of arousal, and sometimes they're, we've measured brain waves and eye movements. Why do you need to ask questions? Why can't you just read out their emotional state from your machines? And I think that, conceivably there might be a way of doing that, but I think that in the end, people are pretty good at being able to self-report on their internal state. And I'm not yet convinced that it's going to be easy or even possible to substitute the readings of machines for what people will tell you.
But sometimes we need to also consider, for example, societies where it's a taboo to express ourselves. So maybe also we need to rely at some point now on the tools that help us find the micro expressions, like emotions behind micro expressions, for example, on the face.
Yeah, that's also an interesting point. It reminds me of, this is maybe a little bit tangential, but it reminds me of some work that we did in India some years ago, where one of the things that I was really interested in as an outsider it was in Mumbai, coming to Mumbai for the first time, was what I perceived as the tremendous difficulty of being a pedestrian in a very packed city that was just overwhelmed with car traffic, and noisy and hot and everything else. And I asked lots of people, we kind of incorporated that into some of our studies as best we could. And when I asked local people who lived in Mumbai about all of that, they'd just say, oh, it's no big deal. You just get used to it, as if, almost, I want to say a badge of honor, but maybe that's not quite the right expression. But I thought, well, let's just see what their bodies are telling me. And their bodies were indeed telling me that they were just as aroused, presumably negatively aroused in those settings as I was. But they just, saying you get used to something doesn't mean that its effects go away. So it's not quite what you're talking about, but maybe related, that people can't, because of cultural constraints, always be completely straightforward about what it is that they're feeling.
So for people who are curious to understand how you can measure people's bodies on the street, like what do you do?
You mean well, I'm not sure how much you want me to say about the technology, but I'll basically say that most of the physiological work that we've done on the street this is changing a little bit now, but has been using something called the skin conductance response. And it's a measure that's been around for over 100 years. It was a mainstay of the old school, probably even the new school methods of lie detection, for whatever they're worth, where you basically attach sensors to two locations on the body. And traditionally it's been two fingers. That's what we do. And then you pass it sounds like it might be painful, but it's not, because it's such low intensity, but you pass a current from one sensor to the other, and you measure conductance. So you basically measure how easy it is for that electrical impulse to move across your skin. And that varies depending on your arousal state because it's related to the state of your sweat glands. And so, the best places to measure it are places where you have lots of sweat glands, like the palms of your hands or your fingers. I forget what the surface of your fingers called, but the under, I'm stumbling now for the word, but fingertips, basically. Yeah. And that's all it is. So if you measure that, it's a measure that has some nice properties because you can attach these devices to people's fingers while they're out in the world doing things. They can't wave their hands around too much or you get lots of noisy signal. But if you encourage them to stand more or less still while you're taking your measures, you can get reasonably good data, as we've, shown most recently in the facade work. And you can buy, if you go online, you can find really simple devices to do this. I'm not always convinced that I won't say any brands, but I'm not always convinced that those really simple devices have much validity. I'm not sure. I haven't tested all of them. I've tested some of them, but you can get laboratory grade gear that costs more, but it's not astronomical to measure the same kinds of things pretty reliably. And we've to some extent relied on I guess it would be right to say hacking consumer grade devices to do things from time to time. So I mentioned brainwaves in passing a while ago. When we did measurements of brainwaves, we did them again pretty crudely because everything in the field is a bit crude. Using these devices that people wore on their foreheads, basically like visors, and they don't give a lot of very nuanced brain signal, but they give enough for you to be able to identify the power spectrum of EEG brainwaves, at least from the front of your head, which can be useful. So we basically have looked for things that you can use as is or simply hack to our devices for field studies. I'm trying to think of other examples. Right now we're heavily into eye movements, and there's not really, as far as I know, there's not really an inexpensive and easy way of measuring eye movements, but you can get pretty good field data on how people are distributing just their gaze through an environment using these devices. So as long as you don't try to infer too much from patterns of gaze, I think it can be a tremendously useful tool for sorting out what's happening to people in the field. You can do simple stuff. One of the simplest studies we ever did on facades was we found a fence surrounding some construction in Toronto, and somebody there had been, it's a long story, but the short version is there had been a public art competition to decorate the fence. And so we thought, I wonder if that public art is actually having an impact on people's mental state. How do you measure that from afar? So I just hired a student to sit at the corner of a block where this fence was and to use a stopwatch to time people's walking speed and to compare that to another site. And we discovered all kinds of interesting things about the impact of that fence and the design of that fence, just from those really super simple measures. How fast people are walking, when they stopped, when they paused, where they looked when they turned their heads. That's an old approach that long predates me. That was used, as far as I know, early on by somebody named William White in New York City, and has been used to some justifiable acclaim by Jan Gehl and his studio to understand how design influences public life. So there's a whole range of things that you can do with some ingenuity that don't necessarily cost a lot of money, can be very, very inexpensive, and can go up and up and up into the stratosphere. To measure these kinds of things. The latest passion of mine, I haven't done anything about this passion yet, but I'm onto it, is something called FNIRS, which is functional near infrared spectroscopy. And it involves wearing something on your head that gives data something like what you would get from doing fMRI. So you can measure changes in brain activity localized pretty well to particular locations. And in some settings, people have been able to do that in mobile participants. So there's some possibility for measuring, having really interesting fine-grained measures of what's happening in someone's brain while they're in a real setting on the street or inside a building. I think there are lots.
There are also tools that help you measure the vibrations of the sound, the contractions of the muscles. Also,
Yes. Yeah, that's
and
right.
it helps understand the emotion behind these contractions and this vibration.
Yeah, you're right. There's all of that. I mean, that's an offspring of earlier approaches where we basically just measured muscular contractions. There's a ton of stuff. I'm a little bit skeptical about. We never really did a lot with it, but we played with measurements of facial expression, and certainly in the laboratory, we got some really weird results from using those tools. And I feel like, maybe in a laboratory setting, this is special. When you have people sitting and observing materials, they typically don't do very much with their faces. And I don't know how true this is when you're out in the world. I had the dream study that I wanted to do many years ago when I was more naive about facial expression, was that I wanted to either set up or take advantage of surveillance cameras that are on the street, which I know ethically would be a bit dodgy to do, but as I said, I was naive, and measure people's facial expressions as they were walking past a building, and measure before they begin the walk and then at the end of the walk, to see if we could light up differences in facial expression that were contingent on just the experience of the facade. I don't know whether that would be possible or not. I don't think we'll ever do it now, but there are possibilities, I suppose.
But what kind of my dream too.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
To compare the beginning, let's say, of the walk with the end of the walk. And especially that there will be many senses, like there will be the noise of the street, there will be maybe someone trying to talk to you, will change the perspective of the place.
Yeah.
And with the memory you have, and inherited memory also that you have about the place, the narrative that you inherited, all these would play a role, like people who were born in this place and people who, let's say, who are whether younger or who are new to this place. All these are very, these small details that show the diversity of the people. But in the end, like I was talking a while ago with some researchers, and we were saying the similarities of people, either like in Beirut or in Boston, they will react the same to some facades. And we were saying like people are the same everywhere, even though you will see this huge diversity in one place.
Yeah. I think, as psychologists, we always say that people are more similar than they are different. I mean, it's important to observe all kinds of different diversity, but there's a kind of a common core of, depends what you're measuring. I mean, some responses I think are near universal. Another one that we've done a little bit of work with is the impact of exposure to nature or biophilic settings. And people say all kinds of different things about about their feelings about nature, but nevertheless, there do seem to be some universals in things like how exposure to nature changes, again, thinking about eye movements, the patterns of eye movements, and also maybe more significantly emotional and cognitive state. So yeah, there's a lot there. So if you ever do these kinds of studies of facial expression recognition in people in the street, you have to let me know what happens. I'll live my life through you, because I'm not going to do it.
Okay. So since you talked about similarities, and I talked about similarities, and basically, apparently, many people in this field see that there are similarities after all between people. What, in simple words, like, can say, what should we do in public spaces or in places with facade?
Oh, well, I think the general principles for designing effective public spaces are probably pretty straightforward, and I don't know that there's anything that we haven't known for quite some time about how to do this well. Not to say that we always are successful, but you want to have enclosure in a public space. But this is going to sound so wishy-washy generic, but you want to have enclosure, but not too much. You want to have complexity, but again, not too much. I think there's kind of a sweet spot. And people ask me all the time, what is the sweet spot? What is the number? How, what's the perfect level of complexity? And I think that's very difficult, if not impossible to answer. But I think that a sensitive designer, planner knows it when they see it. We know when too much is too much. So enclosure, complexity, exposure to nature. So we know that even modest micro scale natural settings in public spaces exert a profound impact. There's some, I just reviewed some of this stuff. There's some really compelling evidence to suggest that doing something as simple as greening vacant lots in a city can have a measurable impact, a markedly measurable impact on levels of mental health among people who live near those vacant lots. What else?
What are like findings that you that were something new
for designing effective public spaces, or just overall?
in general related to public spaces and people's reactions to this.
Okay. Well, I think first would be the impact of facades, getting levels of complexity right. Second might be being sensitive to the impact of building height on people's psychological responses.
What do they do? Yeah.
Being surrounded by tall buildings can change people's arousal states as well, and can change their psychological state. The reports of feeling oppressed, for example. What else?
The higher the building goes, the more you feel.
Yeah, it seems to be. That seems to be the case. I'm kind of hedging a little bit there, because at this point we haven't explored the psychophysics of the relationship between building height and psychological response. What I mean by that is that we've shown that if you are surrounded by skyscrapers, then the effect is negative compared to being surrounded by sort of low to mid-rise settings. But I couldn't say, 15 floors is okay, but 20 floors is not. We don't have that level of refinement.
What we call actually human scale building. So we call it like at some point human scale building.
Yeah.
It's something like 5 to 8 floors max.
Yeah. There's not, at least in my world, but the kind of measures that I use, I don't think that there's I know, there are all these rules of thumb that we use that may or may not be true, like the human scale stuff. I don't think it's been measured in the way that I would measure it. Another one has to do with green space. We've, shown the profound impact, along with a zillion other people, of exposure to green space. And then we have these discussions about what does that mean for the design of a city? How much green space should we have? How far away should it be from where we live? And so I think planners have these reasonable rules of thumbs for things like 5 minutes, that you should live within a 5-minute walk of, even if it's just a parquet at the end of a street with a tree within 5 minutes of where you live, to have psychological impact. What else have we done that would pertain to your...
Something that lets you say, wow, really, like this way, just like this.
What do I have that's going to make you say, wow?
That made you say, wow. Because sometimes we start research having a hypothesis about something.
Yeah.
Like assuming that we will have a certain result, but then we find something very interesting, but a little bit different than what we were expecting.
Something that blows our mind. Oh, here's one. Okay, so this is, as I'm talking about this, I'm remembering this line of research. We became really interested through a collaborator of mine, a past collaborator named Robert Condia. He's an architect in Kansas. We became really interested in questions about architectural atmosphere. And for reasons that are, again, a bit of a digression, we became interested in the relative contributions of what you see in central vision and what you see in peripheral vision on impressions of the atmosphere of a setting. And so we started to do a lot of experiments where we presented people in various ways, some in VR, some just pictures on a screen. We presented people with scenes that were either the whole field or just restricted to central vision or restricted to just peripheral vision. So we had ways of blocking out what would be represented in the fovea and just showing the periphery, or vice versa. And what really was most striking and unexpected about those studies is that, as far as we could see, not only was most of the impression of atmosphere coming from the periphery, but also people talk about gist. So we're very good at picking up the gist of a scene very, very quickly. You can show somebody a scene for an excruciatingly short period of time, and they can answer some questions about what that scene is. And so we did some studies where we asked people to express their preference for a scene that we showed for a very short period of time, like 50 milliseconds, a 20th of a second. And they might say, well, I barely saw anything because it was so fast. And then you use a forced choice method. You say, okay, given that, just rate your preference for this scene. And again, we found that most of that was loaded into the peripheral visual field. So I think, when I talked before about eye movements and I said it's important and eye tracking, it's important not to get too obsessed with foveal vision, is because I think that a surprisingly large amount of information that we collect, information might not even be the right word, impressions that we collect about our surroundings come from peripheral vision. Peripheral vision is not very precise. It doesn't have much color because most of our color vision comes from the fovea, but it has a profound impact on how we feel about where we are, it seems. I think that's a story that's just beginning. But for us, that was mind-blowing to discover. We had some theoretical reasons for thinking that might be so, and that was what drove the experiments that we did. But seeing that people were able to, for example, distinguish between scenes of nature and built settings and express differences in their preferences for nature, even when that scene has only been shown for just a sub-second period, a very short period of time, was really quite compelling for us. And I think it means something. And so when people present, you see these, for example, heat maps of where foveal vision lands on a scene. And when people present that as telling all of the story of architectural experience, I think that's almost certainly wrong. I think that it just ignores everything that we're getting from the world outside of the fovea. I'm not sure that I have good answers to exactly how to correct that impression, but I do think that it's important that we take those things like heat maps as representations of what we know about the world with a very large grain of salt. There's much more going on than meets the eye, pardon the pun.
But also you mentioned something very important, that you were showing pictures like in a fast way, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So we understand and that people, all these images that are coming to them, and now whether like online images and with the rapid movement in general of life and the multiple images that we see and we see in the surroundings and in changing places, all this information are eventually stored, and we have a lot going on in our mind at some point. And this also can lead us to feel this kind of maybe arousal, or this kind of impression, or maybe this feeling of boredom, since we don't have, for example, a lot of images in front of us right now. And we have these feelings without knowing why sometimes. So I think it has some kind of impact.
So do you mean because
already with the image that they were shown in a fast way, they did a certain reaction. They did react. They did say something. So it means that it's stored. They kept it in their brain. And with the multiple images we have now, and even more and more, it makes us at some point maybe feel some emotions that we wouldn't have felt them if we didn't have this many images in front of us now, or this many information on the street.
So you're saying that because of modern conditions, let's call it, we are exposed to a greater variety and rapidity of images.
Yes,
I think that's certainly true, and it's also certainly true that I mean, it has to be true that those images are exerting an impact on our feelings,
and even our perception of the space or of the place.
Yeah.
Maybe if we are in this state, in this emotional state, we cannot sometimes handle, or we cannot accept, for example, a place. We cannot accept to stay in it because of this emotional state that we're living.
Yeah.
These images.
I think I see what you're saying. I mean, I think that there's a certain kind of,
feel this word, irritated.
Yeah. I mean, you can go overboard with this kind of thinking, but I think there's a certain argument to be made that there's kind of a natural rhythm to our inbuilt ability to process information, because we have evolved as animals that walk around, take in the world in a methodical fashion, and through our technology now, including everything, even if you think about rapid transit, automobiles, our ability to move ourselves more quickly over the surface of the planet, but also, probably much more importantly, our chronic exposure to every kind of screen. What is the impact of that on our feeling state? I mean, usually when I think about this stuff, I worry about sometimes I talk about what I call the preciousness of real space. And I think that relates to this, that I think that the problem with, for all of its benefits and the things that modern screen-based technology can do for us, and there's a lot there, it erodes that kind of authentic, unfolding relationship with real spaces. And I mean, you could just look around any city and you can see it. People ask all the time about, the impact of the fact that so many of us, when we're in a public space now, we were talking about public spaces a while ago, we're focused on our phones. And somebody asked me recently in an interview, do you think it's really true that our surroundings when we're in a public space still have an effect on us when most of our behavior is focused on this thing that we hold in our hand? I think, that's, that undoubtedly that's an important set of issues that I don't really have any ready answers or solutions to, or nor do I think has anybody really well characterized what the problem is, what we should do about it. I mean, we're not giving up our damn phones, I think, no matter what. And their attraction is just like, they're designed to be. I feel like now, after my book we talked about earlier, Places of the Heart, has a section about the impact of technology on place. And I remember one of the reviewers of the book describing that part of the book as being a grandfatherly rant against cell phones. So I always have that kind of in the back of my mind, that I don't want this to sound like some old guy saying that technology is not great for us. But I do think that it has eroded and continues to erode something. And I think this is maybe a bit grandiose to say for somebody who only knows the things that I know, but if we look at the state of the world right now, and we look at where the power resides, for example, I don't want to get into politics very much, but where the power resides certainly in North America right now, is showing the potency of screen-based technology and social media to have an impact on everyday life. And I think that's not disconnected with the things we've been talking about here, and the importance which we seem to be somehow losing, the appreciation for the importance of being immersed in real spaces.
And there is still a power in architecture and in the built environment, because after all, we have this human nature that, even if it will change, it will take tens of hundreds of centuries to maybe change a little bit. So in terms of evolution, so the built environment and architecture can still have its impact on balancing this the thing that's happening in our brains now with technology and the fast movement, and that will help us at some point maybe relax or calm down. So there are still solutions for this through architecture, and this is what I believe in, and this is what I work on, actually.
Well, that's helpful. That's a nice.
And many people work on this course through neuroarchitecture and other related fields. Yeah,
you're right.
Any final words you would like to share with us?
I don't think so. I think that we went to some dark places towards the end there. So I think that following this, I'm going to get out of this room and go take a nice walk in the world and remind myself of the sanctity of real space, and maybe visit an interesting building too. But I just would also say it's a delight, an unexpected delight for me, thinking of the whole arc of my life so far, that this field, this convergence of fields, I guess, is really seeming to take hold. And I think, what I often talk about in this context is that what we need is what I'll call success stories. So at the moment, we're at a state where I think there's lots of enthusiasm about ways that we can apply the human sciences to problems in architecture and urban design, what would be really most convincing, again, thinking about the public perspective, is to say, look, we had these principles in mind. We designed this building or we designed this public space hoping that these things would happen. And now we've gone back and we've measured, and the thinking is justified. The resources that we put into building in a way that neuroscience and psychology recommended have been justified. And I think that's something that I think most people agree has not been done nearly well enough. Even, I mean, we talk about post-occupancy assessment, and post-occupancy assessment in most cases, in my experience, is something that we like to talk about but seldom do. And what's even more rare is to do a POA that is based around the kinds of principles that we've been talking about. So if you don't do that, you don't know whether all of this discussion is hot air or not. You don't know whether it works. So that's for the next generations of people working on this. I really hope that there's more of that happening, more interaction, more collaboration between the people who design and the people who measure the impact of design.
Dr. Ellard, thank you for this very interesting conversation.
You're welcome.
And thanks for watching us.